come here and do that investigation, because by doing that, the EU would be sort of violating our sovereignty. Now I want to start with that, and then I want to ask you what we can do to move the discussion forward, because Ambassador said, I think for the first time on our show, that there still is room to move this discussion forward so that we can still be able to get the GSP Plus. So that's where I want to go, but I want to start with this sovereignty discussion first, Rohan.
Yes, well, I think it's extremely sad that the EU investigators' report is so negative, and that there is now a possibility that we may lose the GSP Plus privileges. As you said, Harsha, when we spoke on the same program about a year back, we were actually warning about this possibility, and we said that if there is to be a win-win situation whereby we improve our human rights commitments and record, and also obtain an extension of the GSP Plus privileges, that certain things would have to be done. Right. Unfortunately, the government seems to have handled this situation badly, and instead of trying to respond to the genuine concerns expressed by the EU and try to address some of the serious human rights concerns, the government seems to have taken a very aggressive, combative role, invoking this notion of sovereignty and basically saying that this whole investigation process is a violation of our sovereignty. Yeah. And I think that that's been a huge strategic mistake. Firstly, what on earth is meant by this concept of sovereignty? It's a very vague, much abused term. If you look at our constitution, very interestingly, our constitution says that sovereignty is in the people, not in the state. Right. And that the concept of sovereignty in the people includes human rights. So I actually think that it would be possible to argue that if the UN, or the EU for that matter, pushes Sri Lanka or tries to persuade Sri Lanka to improve its human rights record in terms of the law and in terms of the law's implementation, that actually promotes our sovereignty, enhances the sovereignty of the people rather than undermines it. If you have a very odd, sort of old-fashioned statist notion of sovereignty, as some of our ministers seem to have had in their response to the EU, then I think, it doesn't really make sense at all. And it would have been much better to engage and say, what does sovereignty mean? It includes human rights, and actually then take steps to have improved our human rights record.
But Rohan, Professor G.L. Pires is a constitutional lawyer just like yourself, and it is Professor Pires who's been saying this. It is not some odd minister of the 100 and I don't know how many we have. So, I mean, he's not just going to say, look, you are violating our sovereignty because, he wishes to score some political points. He's doing it with conviction. That is the case. But why is there such a difference of opinion between what Professor Pires is saying and what you're saying now?
Yeah, well, to be quite honest, I was actually quite surprised that my former teacher, Professor Pires, would take that attitude and take that definition of sovereignty, which is really quite obsolete and archaic given modern developments. I mean, look, if Sri Lanka has become a member of the United Nations, Sri Lanka joined the United Nations voluntarily. As soon as you join the UN, in a sense, you give up some of your sovereignty in that absolute power sense. You agree to be a member of a community of nations, to subscribe by certain rules and regulations. And all those three documents that the EU investigation report refers to, the ICCPR, CAT, and the CRC, are international obligations that Sri Lanka has promised to adhere to. So basically, what the EU investigation report has said is to ask Sri Lanka to do what it should be doing anyway as a responsible member of the United Nations. I mean, to me, it's like this. Supposing there's a university student who joins the University of Colombo.
Right.
And then after joining, he says, I don't want to go for lectures.
Right.
Yeah? I mean, a student can't do that. And then over and above that, if the student wants a Mahapola scholar or some sort of financial assistance, and the university says, well, in order to qualify for the scholarship, you have to attend lectures, the student can't say, this is undermining my freedom, I should be able to do what I want. If you join a system, and if you want to get benefits, you have to subscribe by the rules. And the EU rules and regulations made it perfectly clear when Sri Lanka applied for the GSP plus privileges,
right,
that Sri Lanka would have to subscribe to certain international human rights norms, and that Sri Lanka would have to agree to be investigated, because it's important for the EU to decide whether we are actually not only conforming to the laws, but actually implementing them on the ground. So to then, after agreeing to that, say that it's a violation of our sovereignty, with great respect to my former teacher, Professor Pires, just does not make sense.
No, I mean, that is black and white. It's very clear. I mean, we signed up and we said, look, we are, these things will have to be done to ensure that the eligibility still is maintained. And we are now saying, look, you can't do that investigation to ensure our eligibility. But, beyond that, the common person doesn't see it that way. People don't understand really what you mean by sovereignty is in the people. I mean, to the people, it seems as if, we are a sovereign nation, we had things to do, we had a war to fight, and these Western powers are coming and interfering in our business. If you read the daily papers, you see so many people writing to the editor and, columns that are saying, look, we are being bullied. Professor Pires said that the EU is trying to use the GSP Plus as a weapon against Sri Lanka. And there seems to be the belief, the middle class of this country. Look, these are unfair things. Investigations into our affairs is unfair somehow. I mean, and that is set in the context of what we had to go through, particularly during the last year until 19th of November when Prabhakaran was eliminated. So how do you see all that?
Yeah, well, a couple of points there. I think there's a kind of populist argument that is used that any kind of interference or any kind of pressure violates our national sovereignty. And I think that people have a duty, especially academics and people who are a little bit more thoughtful or ought to be more thoughtful, to educate people. Look, the pressure is not to do something that the EU is imposing. The pressure is to do something that Sri Lanka is supposed to do anyway, right, as a member nation of the United Nations. It's Sri Lanka's own obligations that we are being called upon to fulfill. The second point, you're perfectly correct. I think it would have been much better if the government of Sri Lanka had said, we have had an extremely difficult couple of years. We've had to fight against a very ruthless terrorist organization. And in the best of conditions, it's not going to be easy to respect and promote human rights in such a context. It would have been much better if they had been upfront and said, we have certain deficiencies, we have certain challenges, we can't perhaps do all that we are supposed to do under our international obligations, but we are determined to do some of these things. Yeah, but rather than going and giving Peter Mandelson and Ferrero Waldner lectures on sovereignty, I think the strategy of the Sri Lankan government was flawed, and as you said, Harsha, it's not too late to try and rectify the situation.
I want to, quote something from the report. It says, even under emergency or war, certain rights cannot be suspended. And the particular one they're referring to is right not to be tortured or be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment. I think now they're always talking about what happened during the last stages of the war. Even the U.S. congressional report and the discussion that happened